Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. Now, as I speak, today in Moscow, over the last 48 hours, the Russians have been putting on display a vast assortment of Ukrainian Army and National Guard vehicles that have been captured in the ongoing conflict that originate from Western nation states. Now, as I speak, we'll do a quick synopsis here. You can see an American-made MRAP, a French armored car. You can see here Bradley armored infantry fighting vehicle. You can see obviously Hummers and an assortment of other infantry carrying type equipment, support vehicles. And last but not least, a Leopard 2 that is now on display. Now, what are the Russians going to be able to do with some of this equipment? I would say probably not a lot. None of this technology is outside of the scope of what the Russians are capable of producing. Even the armor on the Leopard 2 is something that the Russians can replicate. Now, obviously, when we get into the realm of more updated American and even British Abrams and or Challenger 2 main battle tanks, that changes a little bit in terms of armor quality, especially depleted uranium armor. Now, again, the Russians have that capability, but choose not to use it in a lot of their armored vehicles to reduce on weight. Tanks. Now, what the Russians are learning is not coming from captured equipment, not ground vehicles, not tanks, armored infantry fighting vehicles. That is not what is really helping the Russians, or is going to help the Russians in, let's say, a future conflict, or as this conflict spirals out of control, the possibility of a direct engagement between Russia and NATO ground forces. It is the weapon systems, cruise missiles that have been launched against Russian forces. It is the Russian understanding of how to negate those systems, especially by jamming GPS, the GPS spoofers, and other electronic warfare capabilities. That is what is truly going to help the Russians in any future conflict. The Russians are catching up very quickly and are learning how to take these systems down and learning how to make these systems fairly unreliable. The much heralded ground-launched small diameter bomb. This system was handed over to the Ukrainians, essentially rushed into service to help support the Ukrainian war effort. The Russians knew it was coming, and the Russians were concerned. The Russians had been dealing with the HIMARS and the missiles that have been launched from the HIMARS. They have been dealing, obviously, with the Storm Shadow, whole other category of weapon system. But nonetheless, these are weapon systems that the Russians have been having to deal with. So on comes the ground-launched, rocket-assisted, small-diameter bomb. Game-changing weapon system. Very accurate weapon system. A weapon system that can strike deep behind the front lines. And within a matter of literally hours of this system being fielded, the Russians had already come up with a solution to make this system incredibly inaccurate. So much so that the Ukrainians don't even bother to use this weapon system anymore. And it hasn't been used that long. Also, back to main battle tanks, such as the M1A1 that the Ukrainians are using. Our understanding is now that the Ukrainians, at the behest of the United States, are now pulling those weapon systems, those Abrams, off the front line. The United States does not want one of those tanks to be captured for a number of reasons, not just technologically. It just doesn't look good. Now, they've pulled those weapon systems back because the Russians have become so proficient at hunting tanks with drones. The Apex Predator, the Lancet 3, the Zala Lancet 3 kamikaze attack drone, now fielding some autonomous artificial intelligence capability to hit ground targets. So those tanks have been pulled back. They're not being used. Again, the Russians are adapting to this conflict. And it has NATO, it has the United States very concerned. Because look, let's face it, the United States physically is not fighting this war right now on the ground. And the United States is watching this conflict, and they're watching that maneuver operations, especially with tanks and armored infantry fighting vehicles, are having a great deal of trouble in this type of war environment. Again, and it all goes back to, again, essentially the ability of both sides to have real-time intelligence of what's happening on the battlefield, and then to quickly attack targets on the battlefield with these drone systems. And it's not just drones, there's other systems as well that are being used. But the root cause is this incredible situational awareness that both sides have. Now, right now, the Russians have better situational awareness. The Ukrainians also have very good situational awareness themselves because of the direct support of the United States. The United States is feeding real-time information to the Ukrainians on the deployment of Russian forces. If the United States was not supplying this information, it would be much more difficult. And what I'm talking about is the use of very advanced aircraft and the use of sensors that are on those aircraft, and then obviously satellites. Satellite capability in terms of watching exactly what the Russians are doing is very crucial in this war. As the intelligence that the Russians receive from themselves, from their own satellite network, and from the Chinese, who are supporting the Russians in this conflict. Now, to the northwest of Donetsk, northwest of Avdiivka. Remember, this was a very contested city. This was the fortified rock of the Ukrainian defense establishment against Russian forces. If Avdiivka fell, the Russians can take any target along the front line. That's how fortified Avdiivka was. And Avdiivka is now ancient history. It's fully controlled by Russian forces, and the Russians, furthermore, have moved many kilometers now to the west of Avdiivka. And to the northwest of Avdiivka, we have seen a Russian breakout. We'll go back here and we'll look at the map. Just go back a few days and you can see what's happening. Now, I wouldn't call this a rapid advance, but nonetheless, comparatively speaking, if we've seen maneuver operations over the last year, you could say this is a quicker advance than what normally is seen. And the reason that is the morale of the Ukrainian military is collapsing. The Ukrainian military is finding it very difficult now to recruit new forces. They are quite literally dragging people off the street in handcuffs to fight on the front lines. It is very difficult for the Ukrainians to recruit volunteer forces, the like of which they observed in the early stages of the conflict. In the early stages of the conflict, the Ukrainian army was getting more volunteers than it could use. And as the war has progressed and the losses have become very much apparent, and what is more important, many Ukrainians that could be drafted or conscripted into this conflict simply believe it is a lost cause, that eventually they're going to lose the war, and they don't want to die for a cause they know they are absolutely going to lose. And make no mistake, the Ukrainians are in all probability going to lose this conflict unless it becomes a wider conflict, which is possible. And then, even then, it's not to say that it would be a total loss for NATO and Western forces if they directly intervene in the Ukraine. There's no guarantee. You can continue to hear about that hypothetically if the West were to introduce troops, as Zelensky wants, that they would turn this conflict around rather quickly. It's not the case. Simply not the case. We don't know that. But again, interesting to see these weapon systems now being displayed in Moscow. It is also interesting to see what is happening with the advances of warfare. Electronic warfare, the use of drones, and some of the newer weapon systems, even like the Russians, the newer Kh-69 that is now being used, very reminiscent of some technologies that are on the Storm Shadow. So again, Russians learning from some of these weapon systems that have been shot down or failed to explode or failed to detonate, they're replicating some of these weapon systems. And that's going to continue. And then furthermore, more importantly, is that Russian military-industrial complex. That is ramped up and producing more weapon systems than even the West thought possible at this point. So we are still waiting for the possibility of that large-scale Russian offensive. Again, I believe that we're going to continue to see this fix and hold strategy with limited operations, limited maneuver operations. The goal right now of the Russian military is simply to degrade, destroy, and demoralize the Ukrainian army until it just completely collapses. And unfortunately for the Ukrainians, that's what we're seeing. It's happening. So more to come very soon. As always, thank you for joining us. Have a good day.